For 40 years I believed my mother drove my father away. I built my whole life on that belief, the careful distance I kept from her, the holidays I spent elsewhere, the phone calls I cut short. And then, on a cold October afternoon in the Blue Ridge Mountains, an 80-year-old woman I barely knew handed me a letter, and in the space of one page, the story I had told myself for 4 decades simply fell apart. My mother had not driven my father away. My mother had saved my life, and she had let me hate her for it, every single day, for 40 years, so that I would never have to know. My name is Linda Hayes. I am 54 years old. I teach middle school music in Asheville, North Carolina, band and chorus, the squeak of clarinets and the cracking voices of 13-year-olds, and I love it, and I am 2 years from retiring. I have a husband named Alex who is the kindest man I know, and a daughter named Grace who is 26, and braver than I ever was. We live in a house on a hill outside the city, where in October the mountains turn golden red and the fog sits in the valleys in the morning like something poured. It is a good life. I built it carefully, and for most of it, I built it as far from my mother as I could get. My mother's name is Susan Franco. She is 78 years old. She lives alone in the small house I grew up in, 40 miles north of Asheville, up a winding mountain road in a town so small it barely has a name. And until this past autumn, I had not had a real conversation with her in over a decade. We exchanged cards. We were polite on the rare occasions we met. But there was a wall between us 40 years high, and I had built it, brick by brick, on the foundation of a single belief, that when I was 8 years old, my mother had been so cold and so hard and so impossible to love, that my father had finally given up and walked out the door and never come back. I blamed her for my whole childhood. I blamed her for him. I want to tell you what the estrangement actually looked like. Because estrangement between a mother and daughter is rarely the dramatic thing people imagine. There was no screaming match, no single rupture. It was quieter and colder than that. It was 1,000 small withdrawals over 30 years. It was choosing Alex's family for Thanksgiving, every year, without ever quite deciding to. It was letting her calls go to the machine and calling back when I knew she would be at church. It was sending Grace up the mountain to see her so that I would not have to make the drive myself. It was the slow, deliberate construction of a life in which my mother was a fact I managed rather than a person I knew. I was very good at it. I had 40 years of practice. Let me tell you about my father, because the version of him I carried is the heart of this whole story, and the version I carried was a lie I told myself out of love. His name was Walter Franco. And in my memory he was sunlight. He was the parent who laughed, who took me fishing on the Davidson River, who let me stay up late and put me on his shoulders so I could touch the ceiling. He smelled of pipe tobacco and peppermint. He called me his little bird. And then, the autumn I was 8, he was gone, and the house got quiet and hard, and my mother got quieter and harder. And I decided, with the brutal certainty of a grieving child, that she had done it. She had made him leave. She had taken the sun out of my sky. The memories I kept of my father were few, but I had polished them for 40 years until they shone. The fishing trips, the shoulder rides, a Christmas morning when he carried me downstairs still half asleep, the way he sang in the car, off-key and joyful. I had maybe a dozen real memories of Walter Franco, and I had turned each one into a kind of relic, and around those relics I had built a cathedral to a father who, the cathedral insisted, had loved me completely and been driven from me by a cold and bitter wife. Children do this. We take the parent who leaves and we make them perfect, because perfection is easier to grieve than complication. And we take the parent who stays and we make them carry everything that went wrong, because they are there to carry it. It is not fair. It is just what we do. My mother never argued with that. That is the thing I understand only now. The thing that breaks me when I think about it. In 40 years, my mother never once defended herself. She never said, "That isn't what happened." She never told me the truth about Walter. She let me believe she was the villain of my childhood, let me carry the warm golden memory of my father like a treasure. And she absorbed my blame in silence, year after year, decade after decade, and I thought her silence was guilt. I know now it was not guilt. It was the deepest act of love I have ever encountered, and I spent 40 years mistaking it for the opposite. There were moments, over the years, when she might have told me. I can see them now, looking back. The night before my wedding, when she came to my room and seemed about to say something and then did not. The day Grace was born, when she held my newborn daughter and looked at me with an expression I could not read. The funeral of my Uncle Pete, when we stood side by side and she put her hand on my arm and I stepped away. Every one of those was a door she might have opened, and every time, she chose not to. Because opening it meant the same thing it had always meant, destroying my father to redeem herself. And every time, she chose me over herself. I did not know that was what was happening. I thought she was just being cold. I read 40 years of sacrifice as 40 years of distance. I should tell you what it cost me, those 40 years, because I was not the only one the wall hurt. I carried that anger like a stone in my chest into every part of my life. I was a good mother to Grace, I think, but a guarded one. I had learned. From a childhood I had misunderstood that love could be taken away without warning. And so I held a part of myself back from everyone, even Alex, even Grace, against the day it would be needed. The estrangement from my mother was not a thing that lived only between her and me. It lived in me all the time, shaping how I trusted and how I withheld. When the wall came down, something in me that had been clenched for 40 years began, slowly, to unclench. I am still learning what that feels like. I am 54 and I am learning to trust love. That, too, is something my mother gave me, at the very end. The unraveling began in September, when my Aunt Ruth called me. Ruth is my mother's younger sister, 75 now, and the one member of my mother's family I had stayed close to, because Ruth was warm in all the ways my mother was not. She called to tell me that my mother's health was failing. Her heart, mostly a condition that had been quietly worsening for a year, that my mother, characteristically, had told no one about. And something else, Ruth said carefully. Her memory had begun to go. Not badly, not yet. But the doctor had used the word, and the word was the beginning of a road that only goes one direction. Ruth said, "If you have anything you need to say to your mother, you should think about saying it soon. The window is closing." I did not want the window to close. I want to be honest about that, even though it does not flatter me. My first feeling was not grief or love. It was a kind of cornered resentment, the feeling of a person who has organized her entire emotional life around a wound, being told that the source of the wound is dying and she is expected to do something about it. I had made my peace with my mother by deciding not to need her. Now she was going to die, and I was going to be expected to feel things, and I did not know if I had those things in me. I told Ruth I would think about it. I hung up. I sat in my kitchen for a long time, and then I did what I always did, with feelings I could not manage. I called Grace. My daughter Grace is the bridge in this story, and without her I do not think any of it would have happened. Grace, unlike me, had a relationship with my mother. When Grace was small, I had taken her up the mountain to visit a few times a year, out of obligation. And Grace, being a child, and not carrying my 40 years of armor, had simply loved her grandmother, easily, and without conditions, the way children do. As Grace grew up, she kept that bond. She drove up to see Susan on her own. She called her. She knew a version of my mother I had never let myself see, not the cold, hard woman of my childhood, but an old lady who grew tomatoes and knew every bird by its call and kept. Grace told me once, a photograph of me at 8 years old on her bedside table. I had not known about the photograph. It unsettled me for days. When I told Grace that her grandmother was dying, Grace was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that cut straight through me. She said, "Mom, I love you, but you have spent my whole life being angry at a woman I have only ever known as kind, and I have never understood it, and I have never pushed you on it, because it's your pain and not mine. But she is running out of time, and I think you owe it to yourself, not to her, to yourself, to find out if the story you've been telling is actually true. Because what if it isn't? What if you've been angry at the wrong person for 40 years? I did not have an answer. I was angry at Grace for asking, and underneath the anger, for the first time in decades, I was afraid she might be right. That conversation kept me awake for a week, because Grace had named the thing I had spent 40 years not looking at directly. I had never actually checked. I had a child's conclusion, formed at 8, in shock and grief. And I had never once, in 46 years, gone back and examined the evidence. I had simply lived inside the conclusion as though it were a fact of nature, as fixed and unquestionable as the mountains. And now my daughter, with the clear eyes of someone who loved both of us and was trapped between us, was asking me to do the one thing I had never done. To question the story, to consider that I might have spent my whole life being wrong about the most important relationship I would ever have. It terrified me. It would not let me go. I drove up the mountain the following Saturday. 40 miles of winding road through the golden October woods, the kind of drive that should be beautiful and that I spent white-knuckled and sick to my stomach. My mother's house was smaller than I remembered, the way the houses of our childhood always are. She was on the porch when I pulled up, wrapped in a cardigan against the mountain cold, and she watched me get out of the car with an expression I could not read. And the first thing she said to me, the first words my mother said to me after more than a year, were, "You didn't have to come all this way. I know you're busy." Even then, even dying, she was giving me the exit. She was telling me I was free to go. I understand now that she had been giving me exits my whole life. We sat on the porch and we drank coffee, and we were painfully, formally polite to strangers who happened to share a face. I could see the illness in her, the gray tiredness, the way her hands shook slightly on the cup, and I could see, too, the thing Grace had been trying to tell me about, a gentleness in her that I did not remember from my childhood, or that I had never let myself see. She asked about Grace. She asked about Alex. She asked about my students. She did not ask why I had stayed away for a decade, because she never asked me for anything, ever. And that had always felt to me like coldness, and now, suddenly, felt like something else. We talked for an hour about nothing, and as I was leaving, she said, "Thank you for coming, Linda." And her voice broke very slightly on my name. And I drove home and I cried for 30 miles, and I did not entirely know why. I went back the next weekend, and the one after that. I told myself it was duty, that you do not let your mother die alone, however you feel about her. But it was becoming something more than duty, something I did not have a name for. Each visit, the wall I had built came down one course of bricks. We started to actually talk. She told me about her garden, about the birds, about the long winters alone on the mountain. And slowly, carefully, like a person testing ice, I began to ask her about the past, about my childhood, about the house. I did not ask about Walter directly, I could not. The wound was too old and too deep, but I circled it, and every time I got close, my mother went quiet and changed the subject, and I read that quiet, as I always had, as guilt. I was wrong. It was not guilt. It was a door she had been holding shut for 40 years to keep me safe from what was behind it. On those visits I began to learn my mother as a person rather than as a verdict. I learned that she had taught herself to play the piano as a young woman and had given it up when money got tight. And that she had been quietly proud, all these years, that her daughter made her living in music. She had a folder, Ruth told me later, of every concert program from every school where I had ever taught, clipped from newsletters, kept in order. I learned that she walked 2 miles every morning until her heart got too bad, and knew the name of every bird that came to her feeder, and that she had voted in every single election since she was 21 because, she said, her own mother had not been allowed to. I was 54 years old and I was meeting my mother. It was the strangest and most disorienting thing I have ever done. The truth came from outside her, because my mother would have died before she told it herself. It came from Clara Bishop. Clara is 80 years old, my mother's neighbor and closest friend for 50 years. The woman who lived in the next house down the mountain road and who had, I learned, been beside my mother through every hard thing that had ever happened to her. I met Clara on one of my visits. She came by with a pie, the way mountain neighbors do, and she looked at me with a strange, searching intensity, and at the door, as she was leaving, she took my hand and held it, and said, "I'm glad you're coming to see her, Linda. She's waited a long time for you, longer than you know," and something in the way she said it made me follow her out to her car, and I said, "Clara, what don't I know?" Clara Bishop looked at me for a long moment in the gold October light, and I could see her deciding something, weighing 40 years of loyalty to my mother against the daughter standing in front of her, who had gotten the whole story wrong. And finally she said, "That's not mine to tell you, but I have something that is. Come by my house tomorrow, before you drive back. There's a letter your mother wrote a long time ago. She gave it to me to keep, in case something happened to her before she found the courage to give it to you herself. I think the time has come. I think you need to read it, and Linda, I think you need to sit down when you do." I barely slept that night. I drove to Clara's house the next morning with my heart going like a snare drum, and she sat me down at her kitchen table and put a yellowed envelope in front of me. My name was on the front, in my mother's careful, old-fashioned handwriting. The envelope was soft with age. It had been written long ago and held a long time. Clara poured me coffee. I did not drink, and went to sit in the other room to give me privacy. And I opened the letter my mother had written to me, I would learn nearly 20 years before, and never been brave enough to send. And I read the truth about my father, and my childhood, and my mother, for the first time in my life. The letter began, "My dear Linda, if you are reading this, then I have run out of time to be a coward, and Clara has done what I asked her to do. There are things about your father, and about the year he left, that I have never told you, and that I have let you misunderstand for your whole life. I let you blame me. I need you to understand that I chose that, and I need you to understand why." And then, in my mother's plain and unflinching hand, came the story I had never known. The story of Walter Franco, the real one. My father was a gambler. Not the harmless kind, the kind that takes a family down with it. By the time I was 6, my mother wrote, he had gambled away their savings, then borrowed against the house, then borrowed from men who do not lend money kindly. He was charming and he was warm and he was, to a little girl, the sun in the sky, and he was also a man who, by the time I was 8, had put our family in genuine danger. There were men who came to the house. There were debts that could not be paid. And then, my mother wrote. There came the night that changed everything, the night that was the real reason Walter left, the night I had no memory of because my mother had spent 40 years making sure it never touched me. When I was 8 years old, my mother wrote, Walter had taken me with him, without telling her, to meet a man he owed money to, because he thought that bringing his little daughter along would make the man go easier on him. He had used me as a shield. He had taken his 8-year-old to a dangerous man's house as a way of buying himself sympathy and time. And something had happened there. My mother did not write all of it, even in the letter. Even then, she wrote only that it had frightened her more than anything in her life. That I had come home that night and not been able to say why I was crying. And that she had understood in that moment that Walter, whom she still loved, whom part of her would always love, was going to get me hurt, or worse, and that she could not let that happen. So she made him leave. That was the truth. My whole childhood had been built on the inverse of my mother did not drive my father away out of coldness. She drove him away to protect me, told him to go and not come back, told him that if he ever tried to take me again, she would call the police and the creditors both, used every ounce of strength she had to force the man she loved out of our lives because that man had become a danger to her child. And Walter, who was weak in every way that mattered, went. He did not fight for me. He did not write. The sun simply went out of my sky, exactly as I remembered. But it was not my mother who put it out. It was my father who left, because my mother made the unbearable choice to make him. I learned later, from Ruth, what the letter had been too gentle to spell out. That after Walter left, the debts did not leave with him. My mother spent 6 years paying them off, working as a cleaner and a seamstress and a cook, 3 jobs at once, and the worst of it, so that the men who came to the house would stop coming, so that I would have a home, so that the danger Walter had brought into our lives would be paid down dollar by dollar until it was gone. The long hours I had resented as a child, the exhausted mother who was never home, who was hard and short and absent, that was a woman working herself to the bone to undo what my father had done and keep me safe and fed, and never once telling me why, because telling me why meant telling me about Walter, and she would not. And here is the part that undid me completely, sitting at Clara Bishop's kitchen table with the cold coffee and the October light. My mother wrote, "I could have told you all of this. Many times, over the years, when you looked at me with such anger, I wanted to tell you. Because the truth would have turned that anger somewhere else. But I could not do it. Because you loved your father. You loved the memory of him so much, and you had already lost him. And I could not bear to take the last thing you had, the good memory, and replace it with the truth of what he was. I decided that it was better for you to have one parent you remembered with love, even if it cost me your love entirely. I chose to be the one you blamed. I have never regretted it. I would do it again. You were worth it. You were always worth it." I do not have words for what that letter did to me. 40 years of certainty, turning over in the space of a single page. Every cold memory of my mother recast the long hours she worked, 3 jobs at times, that I had read as her not wanting to be home with me, were her keeping us afloat after Walter's debts. The hardness I had resented was a woman holding herself together by sheer will. The silence I had read as guilt was a mother biting down on the truth for 4 decades to protect her child's heart. And the photograph on her bedside table, the picture of me at 8, was a woman who had lost her daughter's love and kept loving her anyway, every day, in a silence I had mistaken for indifference. I had spent my whole life being angry at the one person who had loved me most. I sat at that table, and I came apart. I sat in Clara's kitchen for a long time after I finished the letter. Clara came back in eventually, and sat across from me, and did not say anything, just put her old hand over mine, and after a while she said, "She made me promise I'd never tell you while she could still stop me. She said you'd had enough taken from you." I argued with her about it for 30 years, Linda. I told her you deserved the truth. She said the truth wasn't a gift, it was a weight, and she'd rather carry it than hand it to you. I asked Clara if my mother had ever, in all those years, said she regretted it. Clara shook her head slowly. "Not once," she said. "The only thing she ever said she regretted was the distance, not the choice. Just that the choice cost her you." I drove back up the mountain that same afternoon. I did not call ahead. I drove the 40 miles with the letter on the seat beside me, and my whole understanding of my life rearranging itself with every mile. And I pulled into my mother's driveway, and I got out of the car, and she was on the porch, wrapped in her cardigan. And she saw my face, and she saw the letter in my hand, and she went very still. She knew immediately what had happened, that Clara had given it to me, that the secret she had kept for 40 years was a secret no longer. And we looked at each other across that yard, my dying mother and I, and neither of us could speak. And then I said the only thing there was to say. I said, "Mama," the child's word. The word I had not called her in 40 years. And my mother put her hand over her mouth, and her shoulders began to shake. I went to her. I climbed the porch steps, and I took my mother in my arms for the first time in my adult life. And she was so small, so frail, so much lighter than the weight I had assigned her in my anger. And she cried into my shoulder the way I had cried in the car, 40 years of it, all the grief she had carried alone. And I said, "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me hate you?" And she pulled back and looked at me with her wet eyes, and she said, "Because you needed one of us to be good. And he was gone. So it had to be him you kept. I had you for 8 years, Linda. I knew you. I knew you couldn't carry the truth about him and survive it as a child, so I carried it for you. That's all. That's all it ever was." And I understood that I was in the presence of a kind of love I had not known existed, and that it had been beside me, unseen, my entire life. Grace came with me on many of those final visits, and watching the two of them together taught me something I will carry the rest of my life. My daughter loved my mother without complication, the way I never had. And in their easy warmth, I could see the relationship my mother and I might have had if I had only checked the story sooner. But I could also see that Grace's love was itself a kind of bridge, that my mother, through her granddaughter, had kept a foothold in my life all those years, had heard about me, had been kept current on my joys and troubles, had loved me at one remove, because one remove was all I would allow. Grace had been carrying messages between us for years, without any of us quite naming it. The day I finally crossed the bridge myself, I understood that my daughter had been holding it open the whole time, waiting, with a patience that humbles me. We had for months. That is what the heart gave us. In the end, for months between the letter and the morning, she did not wake up. And I want to tell you that we spent them well, because we did. I drove up the mountain every weekend and many weekdays. And Alex came, and Grace came. And we sat in that small house, and I got to know my mother for the first time at 54 years old. She told me about Walter, the real Walter. Finally, the charming weak man she had loved and lost and protected me from. She told me about the early years, the good ones before the gambling. She told me about the night she made him leave, all of it this time, and I held her hand while she told it. She told me about the decades of silence, and what they had cost her, and she said she would pay it all again. We did not get 40 years back, but we got 4 months that were worth more than I can say. In those 4 months, I asked her all the questions I had stored up for a lifetime without knowing I was storing them. I asked her about her own childhood, and she told me about growing up poor, in the same mountains, the youngest of 6, and about her mother who could not vote, and her father who could not read. I asked her how she had managed those years alone, and she shrugged and said, "You do what you have to do," which I had heard as coldness my whole life, and now heard as the simple iron of a woman who had been strong, because there was no one else to be. I asked her if she had ever wanted to marry again, and she said no, that she had loved one weak man badly enough for one lifetime, and that anyway she had me, and that I had been enough. I had been enough. I had spent 40 years certain I had never been enough for her. She had spent 40 years certain I was everything. Her memory came and went in those months, the way Ruth had warned. Some days she was entirely herself, sharp and dry and present. Some days she drifted, called me by her sister's name, asked about people long dead. But here is the mercy I did not expect. Even on the days she lost the present, she never lost me. She always knew I was Linda. She always knew I was her daughter, and that I had come back, and that the long cold war between us was over. On one of the last clear days, she held my hand on the porch and watched the fog burn off the valley, and she said, "I used to be afraid I would die before you knew, that you would spend your whole life thinking I didn't love you. I'm not afraid anymore." And I said, "I know, Mama, I know now." And she smiled and closed her eyes in the October sun, and we sat there, and it was enough. After 40 years, it was enough. My Aunt Ruth told me, near the end, the things my mother would never have told me herself, the full weight of what those decades had cost her. How my mother had loved me so fiercely and so silently that she had refused, again and again, every chance to win me back. Because winning me back meant destroying my father in my eyes, and she would not do it. Ruth had begged her, over the years, to just tell me the truth. My mother had always refused. She'd rather Linda love a dead man's ghost than lose her father twice, Ruth told me, crying. That's the kind of mother she was, the kind nobody ever saw, because she made sure nobody ever saw. I think about that constantly now. The mothers nobody sees. The love that disguises itself as coldness in order to do its hardest work. I found out, in those months, that Walter had died years ago, somewhere in Tennessee, alone, still chasing whatever he had always been chasing. My mother had known and had not told me, because telling me would have raised the question of how she knew, which would have raised everything else. So my father had died, and I had not known, and had not grieved, and the warm golden ghost I had carried for 40 years had quietly become an actual dead man without my ever being told. I do not know what I feel about Walter now. Some grief, still, for the father a child loved, but it is complicated now, weighted with the truth. and the simple golden version is gone, and I find I do not miss it as much as I would have thought. The truth is heavier. But it is mine, and it is real, and real is better. My mother, Susan Franco, died on a clear cold morning in February, in her own bed, in the house on the mountain, with me beside her holding her hand. She was 78, Grace was there, and Ruth, and Clara from down the road. It was peaceful, and it was not too soon, and it was not, somehow, the tragedy I had braced for my whole life, because the tragedy would have been losing her the way I almost did. With the truth still buried, and the wall still standing. Instead, I lost her having found her. I lost her as my mother, fully and finally my mother. After 40 years of being strangers. That is a grief I can carry. The other kind I am not sure I could have survived. I went through my mother's house after she died, the way you do, and it was an education in a woman I had spent my life refusing to know. The folder of my concert programs, every one. A drawer of cards I had sent her over the years, the cold, dutiful cards, kept and ordered as though they were love letters, because to her they were proof her daughter still thought of her, however coldly. A cookbook with my childhood favorites marked in the margins, decades old, the pages soft from use. And in her closet, wrapped in tissue, the dress she had worn to my wedding, kept for 30 years. I sat on the floor of that closet with the dress in my lap, and I understood that I had been loved, enormously and constantly, and in total silence, by a woman I had decided did not love me, and that the evidence of it had filled this house the whole time, 40 miles up a road I would not drive. I want to tell you about the photograph, because I have it now. The picture of me at 8 years old that sat on my mother's bedside table for who knows how many years. After she died, I found it, and on the back, in her handwriting, faded with age, she had written, "My little bird, the reason for everything." I say those words to myself some nights, and I feel her hand in mine on that porch, and the fog burning gold off the valley, and the 4 months we were given, and I am against everything, at peace. My little bird, that was my father's name, for me Walter's name, the warm sweet thing the sun in my sky used to call me. And my mother had known it, of course, she had known it, and she had taken even that, even his pet name for me, and made it her own, and kept it, and treasured it, in silence, for 40 years. I keep that photograph on my own bedside table now. I look at it every night, my little bird. The reason for everything. I have spent a great deal of this past year thinking about the story we tell ourselves about our parents, and how early we write it, and how rarely we revise it. I wrote my mother as the villain when I was 8 years old, in grief and shock, and I never once, in 40 years, went back to check whether the story was true. I built a life around a child's conclusion, and I almost carried that conclusion to my mother's grave, and would have, if not for a dying woman's failing heart, and a daughter brave enough to ask the right question, and an old neighbor with a yellowed letter, and a mother who loved me enough to let me hate her. The margins are so thin, I came so close to never knowing. There is a particular cruelty to the timing of these things, and I have thought about it a great deal. My mother kept her secret out of love, and the keeping of it cost us for decades. If she had told me when I was 20, or 30, or 40, we might have had years, ordinary years, the kind you waste and take for granted, Sunday dinners and small arguments, and the long boring richness of a real relationship. Instead, we got 4 months in the shadow of her dying, every hour of it sharpened by the knowledge of how few were left. I am grateful beyond words for those 4 months, and I grieve, at the same time, for all the ordinary years we never had, the ones her love and her silence spent. Both things are true. I have learned to let them both be true. That is most of what grief is. I think learning to hold two true things that do not fit together, and not letting go of either one. I have made a kind of peace with the 40 years, though it took most of this past year to find it. I used to torture myself with them, all that wasted time, all those holidays I chose to spend elsewhere, all the conversations we never had. But my mother would not have wanted me to live in that grief, and she told me so. In one of our last clear talks, she said, "Don't you dare spend the time you have left being sorry about the time we lost. That's just another way of not living. I made my choice, and it bought you a childhood you could survive. Don't make it worthless by hating yourself now. So I try not to. I try to hold the 4 months and not the 40 years. Some days I manage it. It is, I have found, a kind of daily practice, like scales on the piano. You do not master it. You just keep doing it. People ask me, when I tell pieces of this story, whether I am angry at my mother for keeping the secret so long, for letting me lose all those years when one conversation could have given them back. And I understand the question, but the answer is no. I am not angry at her. How could I be angry at a woman for loving me too much to hurt me? She made a choice I would never have had the strength to make. She looked at her own deepest need, to be known by her daughter, to be loved by her, to not be the villain, and she set it down, for 40 years, because she judged that my need was greater. That is not a thing to be angry about. That is a thing to kneel down in front of. I spent 40 years angry at the wrong thing. I am done being angry. I am just trying, now, to be worthy of what she did. I teach my middle schoolers a thing about music that I understand differently now. I tell them that the rests, the silences, the held breaths between the notes, are not empty. They are part of the music. A piece without rests is just noise. It is the silence that gives the notes their shape and meaning. My mother was a held silence in my life for 40 years, and I read that silence as absence, as coldness, as nothing. I know now it was the most meaningful part of the whole composition. She was not absent. She was holding a rest, a long, deliberate, loving silence, so that the music of my childhood could have a shape I could survive. I did not understand the score. I understand it now, and I will spend the rest of my life learning to read the silences of the people I love more generously than I read hers. I want to tell you about my first day back at school after the funeral, because it is where I understood that something in me had changed for good. I stood in front of my 7th grade chorus, 40 13-year-olds in a stuffy band room, and I raised my hands to start them singing, and I looked at their faces, all those children, each one carrying a whole family I would never see, each one writing the story of their parents right now. Today, in real time, and I thought, be gentle with them. Whoever they are at home, be gentle, because you do not know what they are carrying, and you do not know what their mothers are carrying in silence. I have always loved my students, but I teach them differently now. Clara Bishop and I are friends now. I drive up the mountain still, most months, to sit on her porch and drink coffee and look at the valley where the fog pours in. She is 80 and sharp as a tack, and she tells me stories about my mother that no one else alive can tell. My mother young, my mother laughing, my mother before the weight came down. Through Clara, I am still getting to know my mother, even now, even after. Ruth too, my aunt and I are closer than we have ever been. 2 women who loved the same difficult, magnificent woman and lost her, who keep her alive between us and the telling. 3 generations of women, holding the memory of a 4th, on a porch in the mountains. My mother would have liked that. She would never have said so, but she would have liked it. If you take one thing from my mother's story, let it be this. The people who love us most do not always love us in the language we are listening for. We are listening for warmth, for words, for presence, and sometimes love arrives instead as a hard choice made in silence. As a sacrifice we never see, a woman working 3 jobs and saying nothing and letting us blame her so that we can keep one good thing. Learn to read the other languages of love. Learn to ask whether the coldness you resent might be a fire someone is carrying away from you so it does not burn you. I learned it too late to give my mother the years she deserved, but I learned it, and so I want to say this to you. Whoever you are, listening to this, carrying your own old story about a mother or a father you long ago decided you understood. I want to tell you, go back and check. Before the window closes. Before the heart gives out. Ask the question you are afraid to ask. Read the letter. Talk to the aunt, the neighbor, the one who was there. Because the story you wrote when you were young and hurting may not be the true one. And the person you have cast as the villain may be carrying a love so large and so silent that it disguised itself as the very thing you blamed them for. We get our parents wrong so easily, and we hold those wrong verdicts so tightly. and we are running out of time to get them right. Do not let pride or old anger keep you from the one conversation that could give you back a person you still have. I almost did. I came within a failing heartbeat of never knowing. Do not come as close as I did. My mother let me hate her for 40 years so that I could keep one good thing from a childhood that had so little of it. She gave up my love, the thing she wanted most in the world, to protect me from a truth she decided I could not bear. And she never told me, and she would never have told me, and I would have buried her as a stranger if the truth had not come to me by other roads, in time, just barely in time. I got 4 months. 4 months to call her mama. 4 months to know the woman who had loved me, unseen, my entire life. They were the most important 4 months I have ever lived, and I would trade every comfortable, righteous, angry year of the 40 that came before them for just one more of those 4 months. But I do not get that. None of us do. We get what we get, and if we are very lucky, we get it in time. My name is Linda Hayes. I am 54 years old. And a year ago I learned that the mother I spent my life resenting was the person who loved me most in all the world. And I got to tell her that I knew, before she died, and that is a grace I did not deserve and will be grateful for, until my own last breath. If this story reached something in you, if there is a mother, or a father, or anyone you long ago decided you understood, please, do not wait. Go back. Check the story, ask the question you are afraid to ask, while there is still someone there to answer it. And if this story moved you, please like this video and leave a comment telling me about the person you need to call, because I read every one. And subscribe to The Silent Diary, where a new woman's truth is told in full every week. Hold the people you have left while you still have them. Take care of yourselves. I will see you next time.